Hello, colleagues, and welcome to week 1 of learning. This week, our focus will be to really think about the reading process and what emergent readers really need even before they come to school. So I want to begin our conversation in thinking about the reading process itself and the complexity of the reading process. So when we think about it, reading itself is really just not a set of skills. It's really an integration of many skills, and we have to think about this as a collective process. So let me just share this quote with you. If literacy teaching only brings a simple theory to a set of complex activities, then the learner has to bridge gaps created by the theoretical simplification. And so this quote by Marie Clay really helps us as educators to remind us of the complexity of each one of the set of skills that comes together for learners. So when we think about literacy as a whole, we have to remember this dynamic process that really begins for students at really from the time of birth, when they have interactions with parents and guardians, so that their environment really impacts how they take on meaning. So through talk and interactions and relationships, they truly are learning about the world. And it's in that place that they start to develop some type of meaning. And so even before they come to school, they really come with a set of skills, really sort of understanding that perhaps print takes on some type of meaning depending on their environmental impacts. And so we really want to think carefully about what are those events that have been in students' lives that have really impacted their development. And for us, in thinking about focusing on emergent readers and the process of learning to read and how we play a role in really identifying those characteristics and really looking for those characteristics and having a deep understanding of that skill set so that we can be able to support students and through the assessment process. Each one of us really has our own philosophy on what reading really is and what's our belief system around reading. So what's really important to a reader, what's important to learning to read. And so sometimes we have to stop and pause and take a minute and really think about what is our belief system. And sometimes the way that we have been taught to read sort of impacts our belief system on how to connect students from all the processes from learning to read and what reading really means. And so take a minute and pause this video and really just jot down a couple of ideas that you might look at later on in the course and really think about your belief system. How did I learn to read? What was easy for me? What was difficult for me? And how did my teachers support me? Or what were the things that were really neglected that I really sort of really needed in this particular process? So I know for me, when I reflect back on the process, I remember being a first grade reader, and we engaged in a practice that is really been researched and really shows to not have a lot of impact on students, which is round robin reading, where all students are sort of sitting in a group and each student reads a section of the text while all the other students listen. And then when they're finished, it's the next person's turn. And so each person takes a turn. And so for me, as a first grader, I always came home and my reports were glowing from my teacher. And I really had to remember that I have to reflect back on that process at this time to really be able to identify with my belief system. And so I know for me as a learner that wasn't successful, I simply used to wait until it was my turn. I would look at the high frequency words that other students were saying. I would find my words on the page. I was busy practicing what it was that I had to read even before it was my turn. And so I wasn't even listening or working on comprehension or really engaging enough in the reading process in order to make growth. So take a moment, pause this video, take some notes on your process for reading, because sometimes our belief system on what our experiences were will really impact us. So take a minute to do that. Hi, I hope you'll find your notes useful as you reflect back on them as we continue through this course. So I want to take a minute to really highlight that each student's experiences as they come into school have been unique. Some students have been exposed to certain languages. Some students have been exposed to different experiences prior to entering school. And so their prior knowledge plays a huge role in what they're able to engage in as learners. And so we want to remember that there's an integration of all of this work as we're thinking about how to differentiate instruction for them and where they're at developmentally. So some of the assessments next week that we will focus on will really be to get a gauge on their interactions with texts. And so right now, this week, we'll think about some foundational information about these particular children. And then next week, we will engage in some initial assessments, which really observe how they interact with text. So even from some of their experiences, we want to remember that some students have been read to more or have had experiences with text in the past where other students really have a lack of understanding of that text really brings meaning and what all those squiggly lines on the page really mean. And so we want to gauge where students are at. Now, I want to highlight that these prior learning experiences are critical and important, especially with vocabulary and development, but it doesn't mean that it has impacted a student that they will not become literate. We want to always keep in mind that we take the student from where they are. We use assessment as a way to gauge their stance as a learner right now. And then we use our instructional practices and our goals and our goal setting to be able to impact where they need to get to next. So we always want to keep in mind of this developmental process and where students are at and really differentiate our steps as educators moving forward. We want to remember that reading is such a complex process and that students are really using various sources of information without any type of hierarchy to be able to engage with text to create meaning. So essentially, they're thinking about what makes sense in the world, what would make sense in a certain situation, and what does the context of that situation look like or feel like. They're using some visual information from the text. So what information do the letters and or sight words, right? What information does that provide them? And then they're using the structure of language and the structure of the text to be able to support them as they are reading. And so we want to remember this balance of information that students gather as they are reading in this complex process really helps them to become readers and think about what would the story sound like, how would it sound as a language structure. So we know that students who have difficulty in even just creating oral language are going to have a lot of difficulty when it comes to the way a book talks. So it's a little bit different than the way oral language is structured together, but students who typically have difficulty are really going to have difficulty in that area. So throughout this entire course, we're going to have many conversations about really thinking about balancing this information for students. So as they are working through what would make sense in that meaning and really observing what students are paying attention to. Sometimes students are paying too much attention to that visual information from letters, which we know that many words don't really correspond with the way they're written, and they need to be able to take on many sight words, or that syntax of language, like can we say it like that? So for students, we want to pay attention to what sources of information are they using to become readers, or as they are reading and developing that process as a reader, and what types of information are they neglecting. So it's important for us to notice what they're using so that we can support their strengths to be able to support sometimes the information that they are neglecting. So for our students, we're really going to be using this sort of as a foundation for our assessment processes as we learn to take running records, as we learn to engage in observing students and what they're paying attention to. It will always sort of land in these categories in that balance of information that a text provides. And it will be up to us as educators to be able to notice these things about students so we can support them and set the best goals for them, and then set that instructional pathway to make them successful readers. B, as sometimes it's referred to, or the 3 cueing systems, are essential for us to consider and think about. I will be posting this inside of Blackboard for you sort of as a reference. And so you'll notice, right, that the meaning is the semantic cues from their prior knowledge of a topic or experience. Also the pictures. If students are using the picture, they're also using the semantic cues, and they're really sense of story. So we want to remember that students who have a great sense of story from beginning, middle, and end, sort of plot development, students who have even engaged in watching television, right? They have some type of story sense that a story begins and it has some type of problem, and then in the end it's sometimes solved. So it requires us as educators to really connect those dots for them, but they typically have some type of story sense. Then we want to think about that structure piece, right? That syntax, like, does it sound right as we speak? Knowledge of the way that language is put together in sentences, phrases, paragraphs, and grammatical patterns. And I also want to highlight structure of the text, right? So sometimes that supports students when it comes to nonfiction readers as they get beyond the emergent stages. So sometimes we hear structure referred to in different ways. And finally, that visual graphophonemic, right? We know that students cannot access print unless they can develop a solid foundation with their phonemic awareness and their phonological skill set. So without the knowledge of letters and words and print conventions and directionality, right, how print works, that students are at a deficit. So that balance of these 3 cueing systems, students will need to balance these sources. But oftentimes what we'll notice in the assessment process is that sometimes students are relying too heavily on meaning. So they will look at the pictures and then they're not paying attention to any of the visual information or the way print works, and they're sort of making the story up as they go along. But we want to really highlight and celebrate that they understand that print has meaning and that they have a sense of story as they're moving forward in their literacy development. So I just want to take a minute. So this would be a typical beginning reader text, probably a level A text, right? So it's a pattern text. We'll notice there's a lot of high frequency words in this text. And with just a brief conversation with a student, we can often sort of get them on that path of reading and really that self-efficacy, that they believe in their sense as a reader to be able to engage with a text. So you'll notice that based on their prior knowledge. They may know what a play is or not. So this might not be an appropriate text for some students. This may feel like something that they can't relate to in any way, shape, or form. So we know text selection is huge for students, and we want to be sure that as we're engaging them in this beginning literacy learning, we want to really put things in front of them that, yes, we can teach additional content and vocabulary, but really that they feel confident with some of the prior knowledge and information and experiences, so that they're not just working on figuring out what is this all about rather than paying attention to the job that readers have when they're engaging. But you'll notice that students will be able to use the scaffolds from the pictures to be able to engage with the text, and really noticing that repetitive language. So each page, if you were to begin this as a scaffold, reading that first page, look at me, I am a mouse. So they have the picture, and then they also have the additional picture from the play. And then each page really supports them with that same structure in understanding how print works and having that picture or meaning scaffold for students, right? But at such a beginning stage, they may not have the sight words to be able to engage with this text. So depending on the level of scaffold that you need to provide for students to get them to access information, sometimes we begin heavily in that picture or stage, or that sense of beginning, middle, and end, or that repetitive language of the text, and really get students to notice that the short sentence patterns and how does that really work in a text. So typically a student wouldn't be engaging in a conversation where they would repeat the same thing over and over again. Look at me, I am a cat. Look at me, I am a mouse. Right? That's not the way we would talk, but that's the way this book talks, right? So even just understanding that, and then depending on how much visual information they are ready to take on or not. So sometimes wordless picture books are really supportive for students, and just even getting them to engage with how a text works, right? So that turning the pages, reading the left page and then the right page, right? So those are some places that we may need to start with students depending on our assessment process and what students need. But really thinking deeply about these cueing systems and what students are paying attention to really helps us as educators to take a step back to say, where is this student at with this process, and what do I need to engage them in? And so I always want you to remember that just because a student doesn't know all of the visual information, how all letters and sounds work, they don't know all of their sight words, it's not a trajectory. It really is that these systems need to work together in the way we present them and model them for students, so that when we provide our instruction for students, that we really understand that balance. Because if we solely pay attention to one and not another, then students really are missing out on really supporting as they're practicing. And remember those approximations for students. And so as they're practicing and engaging, we want to provide as many scaffolds as possible in order for them to feel successful. We want to remember that we are using both formative and summative data. So formative data is the data that we take on a day-to-day basis. So how is the student engaging in literacy activities? What are we watching for? What are we noticing? What are we noticing as they're reading? And how are we collecting that data in the process of the learning? And then summative data is sort of at an end point and saying, okay, collectively, where is this student at? How can I collect this data after a student has worked through a certain process? But I would argue that both formative and summative data, summative data is also formative, because if we think about the assessment process, right, assessment itself, we really sort of are identifying a student's strengths and weaknesses and what are they doing really well. Like, we want to really highlight that because we want to use some of their strengths to be able to support some of the things they need to do better. And then how are we using that information to be able to plan the instructional steps and what they need? So what's that plan going to look like for students? And we want to remember that not just one person engages with instruction for a student. So we want to remember that this assessment data is not just solely for a teacher. So if a student is interacting with more than one person, you want to be sure that the assessment process, the assessments, and what you've seen that the student does really well or has challenges with, that someone else, either a special education teacher or paraprofessional or any support staff, really knows the plan for the students so that you can calibrate the instruction. So we want to remember that the instruction needs to sound the same and look familiar in order for students to make progress in literacy. So sometimes our students with the biggest gaps in literacy, they see so many people in the process, and we want to remember that if we don't scaffold and provide the consistency in academic language and in the structure of the lesson, that the student is actually taking on more by having someone say it's a short vowel sound, or it's someone else calls it something different, or even in the strategies that we provide for them, oftentimes teachers have little mnemonics or tricks to get students to access the print. And in order for students to be the most successful and make accelerated progress, we want to be sure that everyone is on the same page with the plan to be able to have that instruction look consistent. And then we continue to assess when the student practices. So what does that practice look like for students? We can't just teach and then expect that students are able to do what we've taught them in literacy development right away, right? So paying attention to the pictures or some of the visual information, or this is the way a text works. We need to really think about having them practice over and over again, being able to identify what they've done well, what they still need support in, and let those approximations, like sometimes they're going to do it well, and sometimes they're not going to do it so well, and think about that formative data that we collect on a day-to-day basis so that, again, our plan shifts and changes so that our instruction sounds different. So as we engage in this reciprocal process again and again, that students will make small or accelerated or substantial progress. And it's through this process that we really want to think deeply about and engage students in and keep it in all areas of literacy. There are some essential experiences that we want to be sure that students engage in, and they're highlighted on page 5 of When Readers Struggle. So one foundational piece that we really want to think about when we're assessing students is talk, and that students have opportunities to be able to talk often and engage in conversations, and that we are assessing that talk as we move forward. So even as we think about them as readers and writers, that opportunity to practice talk will really impact their literacy development. So we want to be sure that they are telling stories and really sharing with a partner to be able to support sentence length and differentiated language structures. And we want to be sure that they're listening and responding to high-level modeled language, and that we have rigorous expectations around talk. So as students are thinking about a text or simply reading pictures, even wordless picture books as they're beginning their literacy development, that we're encouraging them to discuss the setting or discuss what they think the problem might be, or giving the characters names. So all of that essential talk will really be able to support students in making accelerated progress. And then we need to make sure that they have multiple opportunities engaging with authentic text, so that we are not having skills just practiced in isolation, that we're using literature as a foundation to build their skills. So it means that essentially we're teaching skills and then we're always connecting to text, because a lot of the research shows that sometimes students can practice skills in isolation, but then if we don't support that transfer and connect that information to actual text, that students can sometimes lag behind in their progress, and it takes much longer for them to connect the skills that they need. So we want to make sure that they have access to a large number of text every day, and that essentially as students are developing literacy, that they're exposed to multiple read alouds from text every day. So shared reading, interactive reading where you're modeling think alouds, and really just supporting the love of literacy, because that's essentially what we want students to be able to do, and to really support a little bit of a higher level thinking for students as we're engaging them with text. So work that they would not be able to do on their own. And essentially these are approximations, and it's really not something we're assessing, but some type of exposure for students as we're talking to preschoolers or kindergartners about characters' feelings or character change, or perhaps even theme in a text. So we're exposing them to some literary language that may be beyond their developmental understanding, but really just exposing them to some of this information through think alouds. And essentially really thinking about exposing them to text in different genres so that they can understand different purposes for text, and really being careful on text selection as we're engaging and transferring skills for students. So we want to be sure that our skill development matches some of the text, and that some of the text pushes their comprehension moving forward. And finally, really thinking about our instruction impacting students. So sometimes we can use assessment and collect all kinds of data around students. And we have a pile of data that says they're either meeting grade level expectations, or performing beyond grade level expectations, or performing way below expectations. So regardless, we need to set goals for students that feel appropriate, and then really look towards our teaching to be very explicit, to be very clear and modeled, and is very effective so that they understand these foundational skills. So without the proper type of modeling and practice, students oftentimes don't make the literacy progress that we would like to see. So enjoy your readings this week. Think about some of the information I've presented, and then I hope to really get some knowledge gain some of your insights as you sort of record your notes and think about some of the videos and the reading collectively in your reading response log. So I hope that you'll also highlight some things that stood out to you. What were some things that really resonated with you as you engaged in this literacy learning? Have a great week.